Here at CatholicCulture.org, we've begun our Kindle the Fire campaign. This is the campaign that makes or breaks continuing our Catholic mission in the coming year. Your gift during this campaign is crucial for the ongoing production of this podcast and of all our expanded audio offerings. Your tax-deductible donation will be matched up to $65,000 between now and December 9th and can be made by credit card, PayPal, check, and now in the form of stock, donations of which carry great tax benefits for U.S. donors. Faith, says St. Paul, comes through hearing. Working with the Holy Spirit, the human voice can rekindle the fire. And you can too, by your generous support of this podcast and of our Catholic mission. Please visit catholicculture.org/donate/audio to donate now. That's catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Thank you. Please pray that all of us here remain worthy of your trust.
Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, an offering to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras, and this podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, my guest today is John Mark Miravalle. He's a professor at the Seminary of Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and he is the author of a rather good little book from Sophia Institute Press titled Beauty, What It Is and Why It Matters. And we had a fun conversation about beauty, and in particular, beauty as a combination of order and surprise, and why it is that God might have made us to be moved by such a combination. So let's jump right in. John Mark Miravalle, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you teach seminarians at Mount St. Mary's, correct?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So as I understand it, this book originated with your course on beauty for the seminarians. Can you tell me a little bit about how that developed?
Sure. Well, a lot of what I do is pretty argument heavy. So, for instance, I teach classes on immigration, environmentalism, privacy, homosexuality. I've done debates with atheists. I have a book on sort of a logical analysis of existence. So anyway, I was just tired of arguing all the time. And I was biking to work. I work at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Maryland. And I was trying to figure out what new elective I was going to teach. And I just looked around. It was a lovely day. And I said, I don't know enough about beauty. I'm going to teach an elective on that. And then proposed it. It got accepted. Taught the class, turned the lectures into chapters, and sent it to the Sophia Institute. And that was that.
So what was your interest? What was your sort of relationship with this topic before deciding to teach this?
So I was a music minor. I played some instruments badly, but I've done a little music study, and I certainly tried to sort of be familiar with major classics in literature, and I do like trying to find, I guess I would say, contemporary literature, especially the American short story, is sort of the last bastion where what counts as high culture is still accessible.
Interesting.
By the average person. So I'm always trying to look for short stories that, in the New Yorker or in the best short stories of the year that are congruent with Catholic insight. And there's actually a lot of material there. So I would say certainly my biggest lacuna, my weakest area was in the visual
Same
arts.
here.
So I really tried to educate myself a little bit more. I got one of the great courses on European art and was just blown away by that. We live close to DC, so I'd go down to the Smithsonian. I got the history of art. Anyway, again, just trying to get the plastic arts a little more established in my understanding.
Sure. So, it sounds like this was kind of a learning project for you.
Oh, it was great. It was a game changer. It made life harder too, So, for instance, just learning about architecture was great in terms of going to mass in a beautiful church, but it was awfully hard because now not only do I not like certain buildings, but I know exactly why I don't like them, and I can't forget it.
Well, yeah, I found that to be the case with the liturgy. I don't spend a lot of time reading about liturgy or some of the classic texts, that people talk about, Romano Guardini and Benedict XVI, Spirit of the Liturgy, and things like that. But, the bits and pieces I do learn and I become more aware of certain things, it's like hard to unsee those things,
It is. It's fascinating. I teach sometimes in undergraduate settings, and I look around the room and I think, what are we doing? I'm supposed to be talking about the superhuman in a space that's subhuman. How am I going to do this? It grates much more intensely than it used to.
So, as I said, this is a book with a kind of a rare common sense, and it's a general kind of, I would say, it's probably fair to say, a popular introduction to the topic of beauty. It's very accessible. But, most of those don't actually have kind of a fresh take on the topic, and yours does, as far as I can see, which is you kind of take the usual connection that's made by, let's say, authors of our worldview between beauty and morality, and you kind of flip it. So rather than talking about kind of the moralizing obligation of beauty or something like that, or just how beauty, forms our moral instincts or can, you talk about it in terms of a obligation we have towards beauty, in the same sense that we have an obligation to recognize and love what is good. So do we have an obligation to cherish what is beautiful? So was that kind of the starting point for the whole project?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't remember sort of the first insight that I wanted to base the rest of the book on, but certainly that's a big one. Like, what I wanted to say, what I do say from the intro on, is that we're made for beauty, like we're made for truth and goodness, and that beauty sort of fulfills the human person in ways that are not necessarily designated by the words truth and goodness, and so, and specifically, right, in the passions. And the Catechism actually talks about this in its section on the passions, that it's not enough to sort of have our intellects ordered to God or our wills ordered to God. We also are morally bound to strive to have our feelings ordered to God. And so beauty is, I think, and again, the way I phrase it at the end is, I think we are obliged to take delight, and that's in what is true and good, and that's precisely what appreciation of beauty means.
Right. That word delight is important, because I think that in sort of Orthodox Catholic education, there's a lot of emphasis on, love is not a feeling, it's an act of the will. And that's all true. And yet delight can be something that is sort of like deeper than the emotions that we commonly experience. It's kind of a unique kind of emotional response. And I don't believe that sometimes I delight in music without feeling the delight, but I'm still delighting. Does that make sense?
Probably. There's certainly in the Thomistic literature, right, or when, I should just say it more simply, the way Thomas talks about it, with a lot of the passions, including delight and joy, there's a distinction between sort of a response to a physical, a merely physical good, right, like delighting in pizza, or delighting in, as C.S. Lewis says, delighting in having your feet warmed by the fire. That's one kind of delight, which is good and true and proper. And then there's another, higher delight, which is delighting in a spiritual reality, which is often incarnate in a physical form. So having a delight to something sublime, some beautiful piece of art, or your kid's smile, or something like that. So yeah, there's for sure levels. It's crucial to being human, to not just sort of know the truth, not just recognize the way things are, not just sort of, do what you got to do, but to be happy about it, to enjoy it. That's virtue.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can take a very subtle form. So there's this quote, and those who have listened to various episodes I've done on the topic of beauty or the arts will have to forgive me, because I quote the jazz pianist Bill Evans a lot, and he was very articulate. And he said, of emotion in music, he said, there's different kinds of emotions that, are kind of everyday emotions that we feel: anger, love, hope, pity, whatever. He said, like, the emotion that is evoked by great art for him, and I think maybe he referred to Beethoven as an example of that, is not just sort of a facile everyday emotion, but he said it's simply the sense of being in the presence of some kind of perfection. which is sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes beauty will move me with all sorts of feelings, but sometimes it's just that like almost very quiet sense of being in the presence of perfection.
Yes, I think that's true. I think it can never quite be, it seems to me, and I'm open to sort of revision on this, but it seems to me that if you're having an aesthetic experience, it can never be a completely detached, unmoved experience, right? Because you can recognize abstractly, oh, that's very well done, or that's very well made, that's very elegant, or one of the sort of archaic ways of talking about a woman's beauty in sort of non-impassioned language is to say she had very regular features. and that seems to me more sort of a truth experience, recognizing, oh yeah, these things go together well, or even a moral experience, these things are well proportioned. But I do think for an aesthetic experience, there must be some movement. There has to be some response.
Yeah, I agree. And I place it in the area of intuition, rather than like looking at things and making a rational determination that this is proportionate or whatever. And I guess that's how I distinguish the two.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I start the first chapter with the Walt Whitman poem about when I heard the learned astronomer, right? And the poet is at an astronomy lecture, and there's formulas, and there's charts, and he just doesn't like it. He doesn't like talking about the stars intellectually. And so he goes outside and quietly he just looks up at the night stars. And that, to me, Jacques Maritain had this line. He said, the intellect feeds in its own home, but beauty feeds in the wild. So right. I love the idea of saying the intellect takes the spiritual reality out of the matter where it finds it. It mines the ore and brings it home to craft its own jewelry. But beauty goes deep down into the cave of matter and sees the immaterial gold in its native state. When I think about intuition, I think of the immaterial and the material all blended together in the experience such that you really can't disentangle them.
Right. Well, that's why I think there's a problem with trying to sort of prove that something is beautiful by abstract analysis. It's not that analysis can't teach us anything, but it's not really the fundamental thing. So what you just said is interesting about like, could you repeat that Maritain line that you quoted?
It was something like the intellect feeds in its own home. Just the intellect, right? Abstraction, which is the act of the intellect, literally means extraction, right? It means pulling out. So the mind, when it's functioning, for truth, it takes a material thing and it rips the spiritual significance out of it and presents it as a formula or an idea. But with beauty, there's that ripping out of the spiritual component, the spiritual sort of form, doesn't happen. Instead, the form is appreciated precisely in the matter as you see it there. That's why beauty generally centers on delighting in a sense image, something material.
I think that's probably why, and I'm not speaking in terms of the sense image so much, but in terms of the going out. That's why beauty is the experience of beauty is such an important thing in teaching us about love and love in contemplation and like resting and instead of thinking. I'm reading a book by Maritain's student, Yves Simon, called The General Theory of Authority, which you're probably familiar with.
Not really, honestly. Tell me.
This point actually goes beyond the topic of aesthetics and into intuition in all sorts of different areas of life.
Yeah, that's right. And I agree with you that it's ecstatic, and so it does draw the person out, whereas cognition is really can be a very immanent experience. You can sort of stay trapped in your own head with truth, but not so much with goodness or beauty. I think that's right. Right.
So later in the book, you say that delight is the supreme passion. What do you mean by that?
Well, every other passion, every other urge. So Aquinas, articulates, 6 plus 5. So he articulates 11 passions, 11 motivators, 11 basic feelings or emotions. There's only one of them that doesn't prompt any movement, and that's delight. All the rest prompt you to improve your situation. But delight is the fulfillment of what you want, because delight is appreciation of the good. And so delight prompts you to rest. Delight says, you know what, actually, let's stay here. This is good. This is good. Let's not do anything right now. This is a good place to be. And so, heaven, which the letter to the Hebrews describes as the ultimate rest, is delight. It is the raw ultimate experience of delight in the supreme good. Aquinas actually says that if you want, you can say that the purpose of human existence is delight, because the experience of heaven is the rest in the supreme good, which is simply the most perfect form of delight there is. So we were made for precisely what beauty offers us.
Yeah, and that's such a crucial point, because it shows why, Catholicism that is reduced to kind of a rationalism or moralism is going to fail. It's the experience of beauty helps you to see what it's all for. I think that's a big reason why von Balthasar, probably a reason why he said, that of the transcendental is, beauty being neglected, that would bring about serious problems for society.
Yeah, it's devastating, right? Yeah, I mean, just to put in the vernacular, it just sucks all the joy out of everything when beauty is not at the center.
So you talk a bit early in the book about the relationship between beauty and the virtues. So there are a number of different angles you can look at that from. You talk about how it affects virtues, but also the virtues that are necessary for appreciating or producing a work of beauty.
Yeah, and to me, again, since beauty is so connected to the passions, it seems that the virtues that are most associated with regulating the passions and stimulating the passions are going to be the main ones, which is fortitude and temperance. And it seems that since beauty is hard to achieve, you're going to need a lot of courage, a lot of fortitude, a lot of magnanimity. And it also seems that because oversaturation to anything, especially to disordered objects, or with regard to disordered objects, will blind you, will decrease your sensitivity. Temperance is going to be major.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's very relevant, and I find myself fighting that battle, where I've realized recently that I've allowed myself to take up far too much of my time and space with noise, with whatever it is, listening to things like, I don't mean like music, but just listening to too many podcasts, or just having things on, or checking my phone too many times. That's not just sort of like inordinate in itself, but it actually like eats up this space that is necessary for me as a musician to like allow that to grow. Like, it's not just in the moments when I'm practicing or playing or listening to music that I need to, like, but this stuff is at work, whether I'm actively doing those activities or not. And I need the silence and the sort of, I don't know what not detachment, but I'll just say I need the silence in order to allow those things to germinate properly.
Yeah. And more generally, without self-restraint, you lose appreciation for everything. Without courage, you can't make anything of worth. So specifically, without self-restraint, I mean, if my kids if my kids had their way, they would have pizza and chicken nuggets every day for every meal, with ice cream for dessert every time. And the funny thing would happen, right? Pretty soon, they would no longer get excited about pizza and chicken nuggets and ice cream. So sort of everyone knows in all kinds of areas, familiarity as opposed to intimacy, but familiarity destroys appreciation. And without appreciation, you just can't have an appreciation of the beautiful. That's, of course, particularly true. And, I talk about this in one chapter a lot. That's particularly true of sexuality, which is, for human beings, interpreted largely through the lens of beauty.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about art as imitation of nature. I think this is a idea that needs to be understood in a very sort of careful and nuanced way. Otherwise, you get, various, in the visual arts is most obvious that you can end up with kind of unhelpful artistic doctrines, if you're not careful in understanding what that means.
Yeah, I think so. I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think art is only maybe this is a good point. I don't know. You can tell me what you think, but to talk about what sort of my little formula that tries to synthesize the notion of beauty has order and surprise, which I think nature exhibits in a sense most perfectly in the physical world. And I think art only needs to imitate nature insofar as it tries to produce, and again, we're talking about the fine arts here, art only needs to imitate nature insofar as it strives to produce some work of sense or of imagination that exhibits order and surprise. So I really wouldn't go farther than that in talking about how the fine arts should imitate nature. I I think that's it. And I think that's why you have arts like decoration or dance or even music, where the person is not at all thinking, gosh, okay, what natural phenomenon am I trying to imitate here? I don't actually think that's the process of a lot of artistic creativity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. And I think you could give more examples than just order and surprise, but I think the level that you're looking at it is the right level to look at it. I mean, you could talk about the process. So like for music, I don't think about imitating nature in the sense of like natural sounds, but obviously, I don't know if this would even count as imitation, but obviously the way music works is based on the way that sound works, that God has made. So that's nature. I don't know if you would call that imitation exactly, but it's certainly founded on that.
Sure, that's exactly right. And you use the tools that nature undergirds in making all this stuff.
Maritain quotes Aquinas saying, art imitates nature according to its operation. And in other words, not necessarily in terms of like an imitation of the outcome, the product that operation produces. So I think that, that's a good way to look at it. And also, of course, depending on every art form is different too. So, if you're a visual artist, it's going to, or a poet, those two art forms are very much about imitation of nature in a number of ways, or certainly drawing inspiration from nature, doing things with nature. So I think the different art forms do have different levels in their relationship with nature. And I tend to think that, to be great art, all art should have that sort of fundamental relationship on the level of operation that you describe. But on the surface level, different art forms are closer and farther away. So for me, I could be wrong, certainly, but for me, music is farther away, sort of on the surface, from imitating nature. It seems to be more its own thing. Music is very human, and yet it almost seems very separate from the human in a sense.
And certainly, traditionally, as you know, music has been used in lots of imitative ways, right? I mean, when Plato and Aristotle are talking about what kind of keys are okay and what kinds aren't, they're basing it on the presupposition that these certain keys were developed to express, to imitate, and therefore to cultivate certain feelings, certain moods, certain states of the soul. You have Vivaldi, right, with all his imitative sort of themes with the four seasons. You have who's the guy who does he has that drug-induced dream. Why am I blanking on his name? Berlioz, Hector Berlioz. His Symphonie Fantastique, right, where all the different movements represent different dreams, and you can really hear it when someone points it out to you. But in itself, these patterns, the music as such need not take on any of these thematic elements. It seems to me. Yeah,
it's kind of interesting too. You see this in like the musical instruments of certain very primitive cultures, where like in some cases, not necessarily to make a generalization about any one culture's music, but they tend to have a lot of instruments that are clearly supposed to be mimicking the sound of some animal or something like that.
Right.
So it's not that that's all they have, but that's there. So that's there like on a very primitive level with music.
Yes.
I'd like to keep talking about order and surprise a bit. It's really, this is what I love about, I don't know how Thomistic you consider to be, your analysis to be, but one of the things that I love about that tradition is the careful making of distinctions that can bring so much illumination. One of the things you talk about is subjective versus objective surprise, and I just love that you made the effort to make that kind of distinction, because the question obviously comes up. Well, like if I've seen this movie already, how can the surprise continue to be relevant?
Yeah, I do try to. I mean, I'm certainly a trained Thomist through and through, and that distinction between objective and subjective surprise is simply an inversion of Aquinas's distinction between what is objectively and subjectively obvious. And to recognize that something is surprising really requires deeper and deeper levels of insight into it, because you have to you have to sort of meditate at new levels on how everything is contingent, at least every created thing is contingent, and that it might not have been at all. And that right there is a surprise that you should never get over with anything, right? The astonishing gratuitousness of being reflected in everything. And every time you consider a new aspect of any reality, certainly any piece of art, the idea that this was the result either of God's freedom or of man's, and it need not have been, and it certainly need not have been like this. I think that's a truth. That's a fundamental feature of reality that beauty is supposed to be calling our attention to all the time.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me. I mean, it is interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree with your point that, the more you understand a thing, the more you can appreciate the surprises in it. If they're true, if they're objective surprises anyway. What would be a subjective surprise?
So one of the examples I've started using, since the book came out, I've been doing a lot of talking on this. And baseball is an easy example, right? Because I might have been surprised when I first learned how baseball works, but right now I have invested nothing in baseball. I have no real interest in it. I know how the rules of the game work, but I've never voluntarily watched a baseball game on TV. When people take me to a baseball game, I drive them crazy because I just want to talk the whole time. I don't get subjectively surprised because I don't know enough about the darn game. But I guess a very common feature for baseball fans is to say, oh my gosh, I've been watching this game 40 years. I never saw that before. Never saw anything like it. So there's all kinds of objective surprises happening, and I don't know enough to be surprised. So I have to develop my understanding and therefore my sensitivity to the nature of the thing to allow myself to be surprised by it. So that's what I mean. There's lots of objective surprises happening in baseball, and I don't know enough to subjectively be affected by any of them.
Jordan Peterson talks about sort of order and chaos as being these two fundamental things in the universe, and I've never quite found that to be a compelling way of looking at reality. But I think that the grain of truth there is maybe because he talks about the need for chaos to sort of revivify order. And I think that, order and life, or what we would think of as maybe spontaneity, is and the gratuitous that you were talking about. Sometimes we can see them as being as in opposition. In God, they're perfectly united. Like God is perfectly ordered and perfectly and like totally alive and not contingent, but the perfection of the order, like he has this unity of order.
If I could just jump in real quick, I really think that order expresses intelligence and surprise expresses freedom. So nature, someone like Augustine, someone like St. Paul basically says, look, you look at nature, you got to know that there is some person behind this. What's their basis for that? Well, the beauty of nature. But the beauty, I think, again, is the order and surprising features of nature. And the order expresses God's intelligence, and the surprise expresses his freedom. It doesn't have to be this way. So I would suggest that order and surprise reflect as you're saying, the integrity of what it means to be a person, which is to be both intelligent and free. And that if you just emphasize the intelligence, that's stifling. If you just emphasize the freedom, that's chaotic. Beauty integrates these powers in us and reflects those powers in God.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was trying to get at, I guess, is exemplified in these philosophical debates that are very old about sort of the divine will. And, if God is perfect, then does that mean that like everything he does is necessary, as a part of his perfection? If he can't be other than he is, does that mean he can't do other than he has done? Things like that. And I think that, that's one sort of aspect of this sort of order and surprise paradox. But these things are perfectly united in God. They're less perfectly united in lesser things, of course, in a fallen world, but also in just lesser God's creations. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like why we're moved by a combination of order and surprise, as opposed to like what does it reflect about reality, but why does it actually move us?
That's a great question. I don't know, but I've been thinking that it's because the way we experience order and surprise is, again, this sort of unusual. Okay, let me give another example. Because we're body and soul, right? Because we are the immaterial embodied in the material, we have this crazy thing where we respond physically, for instance, to immaterial reality. So the example I always like is fear of public speaking. If you've ever had fear of public speaking, what were you afraid of? You were not afraid that if you did a bad job, the audience would bite you or throw things at you or deny you food. You were not afraid of any physical threat. And yet you respond at the bodily level, right? Your knees shake, your palms get sweaty, you stutter. So that's a remarkable thing, because it means that when we perceive some immaterial reality in physical form, we are moved from the soul to the body. Aquinas says that there's some passions that start in the body and end in the soul, and there's other passions that start in the soul and end in the body. So I think that beauty, because it always sort of centers on the spiritual in the physical, produces in us one of those passions that comes from the soul into the body. And that's why it's so moving. That's why this combination of order and surprise, which is what happens, right? It's always weird. Sorry, I'll stop after this. But it's always weird when the spiritual enters the physical. And sometimes it's silly, as I talk about in the last chapter of the book. But sometimes it's glorious, supremely at the moment of the incarnation. And we are startled to see the right fit between spirit and matter. I think that's always startling to us, even though we ourselves are precisely the locus in God's creation of that fit. I think we never get used to it.
I believe that Nietzsche said, I think I remember reading this passage, that he said, beauty is when power descends into the visible.
I've never heard that, but that would be a nice fit.
You know, it's interesting because you can't necessarily, we're talking about intuition in sort of appreciating beauty versus analysis, and corresponding to that is that you can't just say, okay, so good art has order and surprise, so I'm going to sort of rationally decide on an order and then rationally decide on a surprise, and then I'll have something beautiful. It's not like this formula. It's something that happens intuitively, and it doesn't mean that you can't sort of form yourself to be able to do that in an intuitive way. But
if you could formulate surprise in advance, it wouldn't be surprising.
Right. It should be surprising even to
right?
you.
I mean, if it
even to the artist.
Right. That's right. That's
especially because
right.
We're not in so, especially if the Holy Spirit is involved, which the Holy Spirit is involved, if it's a participation in God in some way, then beauty, then the artist can't be in complete control, and sort of everything is what he expected or what he devised in his reason.
Yeah, and I think there's probably an analogy with the other transcendentals too, right? I mean, you can't make a discovery before you've made the discovery, and you can't sort of have a conversion before you've had your conversion. If you're planning for a conversion, you're already converted, and if you sort of know what the discovery is in advance, you've already made it. And so too, I think if you sort of formulaically anticipate the surprise, then there's no surprise at the end of the process.
I think, a good example, you talk about if you're trying to rationally determine sort of like the ideal ratio of order to surprise, and we don't know what the ideal ratio is. So, that leads again to these sort of different artistic ideologies that end up shackling art. And you talk about like the temptations to choose order at the expense of surprise, or surprise at the expense of order. To me, like an example I always use, there's a quote from Stravinsky, and he said, "What I can't stand are these manic deviations between total chance and total control." He's talking about modern music. So like total chance, you'd have people like John Cage, who's using the the I Ching, this ancient Chinese like divination book to like randomly come up with notes. Or, the total order would be, serialism, because there is an order to it, but it's a completely human imposed order that isn't sort of like organically generated by the way that sound works, and by intuition. There's a story.
Sure.
The jazz pianist Dave Brubeck went to take a composition lesson with Schoenberg, the serialist composer, and he showed him some of his compositions, and Schoenberg was kind of demanding that he give a justification for every note that he had written, and Brubeck said, because it sounded good, and Schoenberg, was like, no, you have to have a rational justification for every note, and Brubeck was like, well, what makes you the guy who decides what music is supposed to be in the future? And Schoenberg, brings him into this other room where he, has all these music scores of, Beethoven and stuff. And he's like, because I know every note of these. I forget how it ended, but basically, Schoenberg was insisting that you should be able to have a rational justification for everything. And I think that's something maybe Catholics miss sometimes, is that just because something can't be rationally determined doesn't mean that it isn't real and objective, So you can't just have a sort of an ideological order that you impose on things. You have to use your intuition.
Yeah, and there's another part. I think that's absolutely true. I think, again, knowledge does work by formulas. Beauty doesn't. I also think that the way that story ends is a very helpful example of one of the places banality comes from, which is a stultified traditionalism. This idea that, listen, it worked in the past, it's going to work now. We circle the wagons, we do what we've always done, that's safe. And that happens artistically, it happens liturgically, it happens evangelically. And we're people of tradition. We know we need tradition. We can't reject or abandon or certainly betray the tradition. But we also have to find always new expressive forms. Otherwise, the tradition will be stifled.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because Schoenberg was, not really a traditionalist. I mean, he was kind of a rejecter of tradition, but I think what you say still actually holds there, because, the end of the story indicates that Schoenberg thought that he had such perfect thorough understanding and knowledge of the old masters that it brought about this kind of arrogance. And so he thought that, I know them so well that, there's nothing more to do there. And, they've done their thing, and I'm going to completely make a new kind of music out of my mind. And he thought that he already knew what was there, and that led him to kind of think that he could do away with it completely.
Yeah, that would be an inverse parallel then.
So we've been talking about primarily artistic beauty, but where do you think that the beauty of the human body comes into this?
So if beauty is for us usually experienced as the incarnation of the immaterial in physical form, then the greatest incarnation of the immaterial in physical form happens at the site of the human body. Because there, it's not just an idea that's being expressed in physical form, it's an actual intelligence. And it's not just sort of a creative impulse that's being expressed, it's an actual will. So this is the most vivid, the most forceful, the most intense place where spirit is expressed in matter, because it's a place where spirit is matter, where you have a hylomorphic unit, you have one being. And that's why the body is the most beautiful object in the natural world. It is the most fascinating artistic subject, and it is in fact the only material thing that God ever chose to be himself. So it is really the focal point of our experience of physical beauty, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are the kind of moral implications of that for our appreciation of the beauty of the human body?
Well, the first one is that it retains its beauty only insofar, right? It retains its order and really its surprise only insofar as we perceive it as expressing a person, a spiritual person, an immaterial reality. So obviously, in certain cases, some of them sexualized, some of them not sexualized, a hyper-emphasis on the body can actually exclude, it can prevent the body's being able to express the personality that it is part of. And, to most people, right, for most people, that's going to really hit home in the case of pornography. That's probably the dominant area where the body, instead of being a vehicle for this sort of incandescent expression of a spiritual person becomes reduced, to use the language that John Paul II has sort of made pervasive in the Catholic world. The body just becomes reduced to another material object. And what's interesting to me is John Paul II said the first time this happened, the first time the human being felt like he might be reduced to just another material object was when Adam and Eve jumped in the bushes right after they ate the apple, or the fruit of the garden, because John Paul II said they experienced cosmic shame. And that was the concern, not that God would see them as a sexual object, but that God would see them as just another material entity in a material world. And that filled them with horror, and they had to hide. They had to hide from God himself. And I've always loved that idea of cosmic shame.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I usually think of them hiding from each other, in a sense. I mean, obviously they were hiding from God, but in terms of needing to cover their bodies, yeah, that's fascinating. The sense of sort of nakedness before God that ceases to be vulnerability in the good sense, and becomes kind of the risk that you start to fear that before God you're just another object that he has made and will do as he pleases with.
Yeah, you're just another, as Descartes says, you're another extended body. That's all you are, right? And that's that's really scary, and that's that's what a lot of people are experiencing. So that's on the one hand. The other I think major moral component of nudity is the sexual component, and sexuality is surprising. Particularly men, when they get used to a certain type of sexuality, they are no longer responsive to it. So the surprise is fairly crucial. And when you become intemperate with that sense of sexual surprise, you go down the rabbit hole of perversion pretty quick, because like all forms of intemperance, sexual intemperance is subject to the law of diminishing returns. And so you got a lot of guys out there who have not appreciated the beauty, that is the goodness, of the female form in a long time, because they are too busy looking for the surprise divorced from the order, and they have they have surrendered themselves to the shock value of fetishism. And that I would say, to be very, very personal, when I was prepping this class and developing these ideas, I was exercising once, and a really perverse image, and to be honest, I don't remember if it was sexual or not, but I think it was, came into my head. And there was a moment where I just wanted to entertain it. And I was so upset. And I prayed to God. I said, "Dear Lord, why would you make me the sort of creature who could find any pleasure in such a perverse image?" And again, I can say honestly, I have no recollection of the image, but the experience was very strong. And then because I'd been prepping for this course and this subject matter, I thought, oh, okay, well, I've been made for surprise. God has designed me, he's built me to react well to this good thing that I am made for, but he's made me, he's designed me to be happy only when surprise is joined to order. And that gave me just an awful lot of sympathy for all the people out there who are really enslaved to the horrors of fetishism. They're not monsters. They're people who have followed surprise divorced from order and are now really trapped.
Wow, that's a really profound point. And thank you for sharing that story, because it really brings the point home. It's really interesting because in the 19th century, you had sort of a elevation of art and artists to sort of quasi-divine status. And obviously that is a wrong a wrong view. And yet I believe that we are now capable of a greater consciousness of the importance of art and artists in society than we were before that. The development of, this is something Maritain talks about, the growing self-consciousness of the artist, and that there are legitimate gains to be preserved and purified from that process that we've gone through. So where should a Catholic place art? Because, I think we're more aware than ever that it's not mere craft, that there is something of the transcendent to it. And yet, obviously, being a priest is a higher vocation, than being a composer.
Sure.
Where do we place artists and art in society?
Well, maybe I could start just by saying that one of the things that I was fascinated with a couple years ago was reading through the Book of Wisdom and finding that in that book, idolatry is sort of attributed to artists as they're sort of the inventors of idolatry. They become so enamored of their own skill and the likenesses they're capable of making, and they start to promote disproportionate emphasis that eventually leads to idolatry. And that was a very fascinating idea, this idea that the idolatry of art, often led by the artists themselves, has been sort of a perennial temptation. One of the things that Maritain says that I like very much is he says, remember, art is about the perfection of a subhuman thing, and virtue is about the perfection of a human being. So I think I would just say that the fine artist is someone concerned with making subhuman objects of very high value, but ultimately they are subhuman objects. Whereas, for instance, you take the priest is one whose work is actually to perfect the human person directly. So that's what I would say, is that the fine art in the broader category of any art, which is the perfection of a product or performance. Virtue and sanctification is about the perfection of the human person themselves and directly. And so art always needs to be subordinated to the process and the work of virtue and sanctification. Does that sort of give a contextualizing?
Absolutely. Yeah, it certainly does. You touch on a lot of things in this book, which is, fairly short and very readable, and I don't want to go too much longer. Maybe to give an example of how the different art forms can perform different functions besides sort of just the provision of beauty itself. Tell me about how the visual arts can refine our sight.
Yeah, so this is something Pieper talks about in his tiny little book, Only the Lover Sings, which is just a lovely... Pieper, for me, is... He's just about the only professional philosopher that I can bring to Holy Hour and pray with. He's such a magnificent meditative philosopher. And he talks about the visual arts, the plastic arts, the arts of visual representation, has training the faculty of noticing. And he says noticing is a crucial moral faculty. And when you are sort of developing the skill either of producing or appreciating visual art, it makes you look twice. It makes you look longer. It makes you look for the idiosyncratic, for the different, for the novel. And he says this is to train the human person in powers of attention. And what I talk about at the end of that section is, for me, for my money, probably the hardest part of the Christian life is to develop a regular prayer life. And that's particularly true in a distracted society like ours. And so training the faculties of attention, anything that can do that is going to be an incredible boon to anyone striving to cultivate a life of meditation. So, for instance, spending time before a picture, a sacred image, or even a secular image, can give us the sort of training, the stillness of mind, the effort of thought, the discipline of noticing what you hadn't seen before, which is often the essence of prayer, whether it's meditation on the scriptures or meditation on your own life or meditation on some facet of God's providence. All that, I think, is incredibly aided by discipline in the plastic arts of painting and sculpture and architecture, and architecture.
Could you give do you have a specific example from maybe your experience with the painting?
Sure. So one of the things I did was there was a book in my faculty lounge that I just flat out stole from the lounge, and I'll give it back if they ever ask for it. But it was from a faculty member who died a couple years ago, so I think I'm safe. And it's images from John Paul II. The John Paul II Institute in D.C. So for me, for instance, I'm now almost 37 years old. Now, one of the things that I think one of his images of what he wants from life is a beautiful woman. I think that's something that a young man, that represents for a young man something that he's striving to be worthy of. Well, I'm not at that phase in my life. I already have a beautiful woman, and I got 5 beautiful kids. And And yet a lot of times I need refocusing on my ultimate mission, right? Because I get real easily distracted by all kinds of stuff. So what I'll do at night is I will look at these images of Mary and her son, and I will think, this is the image that I want to focus my life around, because not only are these the two most important people in all of God's creation, not only are these supposed to be the two most important people in my life, but also this is the community, this is the symbol of everything I exist primarily to support, to protect, and to love, which is my own woman and my own children. And so when I shut my eyes, I can see, because I've been looking at them now for about a year, off and on. I can see these images, and I think, yeah, this is what I want my life to focus on. Not only this woman and her son, the Blessed Mother and the Christ child, but my woman and her children, and making sure that everything else is sort of centered around that.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. I was going to ask you to close by talking about Mary, so you got onto that nicely.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, maybe we can go into that just a little bit more. Mary as, the tota pulchra. What can beauty teach us about Mary? What can Mary teach us about beauty?
There's at least two things that I think are really interesting when it comes to Mary and beauty. One is the relationship between Mary and the Holy Spirit. And Paul VI called for a new reflection on the relationship between Mary and the Holy Spirit that would yield a Mariology of beauty. And I suggest that that's based on the connections between the immaterial and the material that you see with that relationship between Mary and the Holy Spirit. I'm very fascinated by the way the Catechism talks about the dynamics of self-revelation of the Trinity. So who reveals the Father? The Son. No one knows the Father unless the Son chooses to reveal him. Who reveals the Son? The Holy Spirit. No one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. So who reveals the Holy Spirit? And the Catechism says, and it's very mysterious, the Catechism says, the Holy Spirit will not speak of himself. It says that the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit has manners. He's not going to be the first person to reveal himself directly. It says the Holy Spirit exhibits divine self-effacement. How awesome is that? I mean, the Catechism is poetry all over the place.
Wow.
So it says the Holy Spirit is known only in his effects on the soul. And therefore, the effects on the soul that are greatest, that the Holy Spirit produces, are going to be the greatest manifestations, self-expressions of the Holy Spirit. And then you go to the section on the Catechism where it says, why do we canonize saints? And it does not say, first of all, so that we have examples. And it does not say, first of all, so that we know which people to ask for intercession. It says, first of all, the Church canonizes saints so that we can see the power of the Spirit at work. So, the saints are not, I feel like Protestants see saints as side distractions, but a lot of Catholics see saints as just fringe benefits. They're neither. They are in the trajectory of God revealing himself to us, and therefore us having access to God himself. That's why, of course, the Holy Spirit and the saints are the subject of confirmation classes. Those two go together, because the way you know the Holy Spirit is through his greatest art, through his greatest products, the lives of the saints. And therefore, the Holy Spirit will be best known, will be most vividly manifest through Mary, which is why the Catechism actually calls her, it's unbelievable, the Catechism calls her the burning bush of the definitive theophany. That means if you want to see where the Holy Spirit is most manifest, if you want to see his light shining its brightest, well, you go to the window where there's no dirt to block the light. And that window is the Mother of God. So her beauty is based on the fact that she is fully transparent to the glory of the Holy Spirit shining through her. It would be crazy to try to get to know a great artist, to try to understand a great artist, and to ignore his greatest masterpiece. And I think it's ludicrous to try to cultivate a relationship with the Holy Spirit apart from Mary. So that would be I think the key point.
Wow. Wow, that was really moving. Yeah, there's just so much to dive into there, but that was just the perfect conclusion to this conversation. So thank you very much for that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for coming on.
Just a delight. Thanks so much for having me. This was very fun.